I am Gordon, 65 years old, and until recently, a man who believed that family meant loyalty. At our Easter dinner, my daughter-in-law threw a heavy crystal wine glass directly at my face when I refused to let her bankrupt parents move into my home. My son called me a selfish old man while blood poured down my cheek. I simply smiled, drove myself to the emergency room, and called my lawyer. Phase 1 was complete. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who saw you only as a bank account to be drained. The dining room was suffocating. The air hung heavy with the smell of roasted lamb and expensive perfume, a stark contrast to the ugly conversation unraveling across the long mahogany table. I sat at the head of the table quietly observing the predators disguised as my family. My son Bradley sat across from me, his posture rigid, his eyes darting nervously between me and his wife. Monica sat beside him, radiating an aggressive entitlement that she wore as easily as her designer pearls. Across from them sat Howard and Cynthia Reed, my in-laws. They were currently bankrupt, having liquidated their meager assets after a series of foolish investments, and were now staring at me with the hungry, desperate eyes of scavengers waiting for a meal. The silence in the room was not peaceful. It was the tense, loaded silence that always precedes an ambush. Bradley cleared his throat, his fingers drumming a frantic rhythm on the tablecloth. He leaned forward, pushing his untouched plate aside. He told me that they had been discussing the future. He stated that Howard and Cynthia were being evicted from their temporary apartment at the end of the month. He then looked me dead in the eye and demanded that I open my home to them. He reasoned that I lived alone in a 4-bedroom estate, and that it was entirely unreasonable for one older man to hoard so much empty space while family members suffered. He did not ask for a favor. He issued a directive expecting me to bow my head and surrender my sanctuary to two people who had never shown me an ounce of genuine respect. I looked at Bradley and then at Monica. I saw the calculated greed shining in their eyes. They viewed my home not as my refuge where I had built my life, but as an underutilized asset that they had the right to reallocate. They saw me as an expiring resource, a foolish old widower who could be easily bullied into submission. I placed my silver fork down on the table. The sharp click echoed in the quiet room. I looked directly at my son and delivered my answer in a voice entirely devoid of emotion. I told him no. I stated clearly and firmly that my home is my private sanctuary, not a public charity ward. I told him that Howard and Cynthia were responsible for their own financial ruin, and that I would not bear the burden of their catastrophic life choices. The reaction was instantaneous. Bradley slammed his hands down on the table, rattling the fine china. His face twisted into a mask of pure rage. He raised his voice, calling me a miserable, selfish hoarder. He accused me of having a heart made of stone. He screamed that I was an arrogant old man who cared more about empty guest rooms and dusty antiques than the survival of my own flesh and blood. He demanded to know what kind of father abandons his family in their hour of need. He told me that I was a pathetic, lonely figure, and that I deserved to die alone in that massive empty house. Monica did not try to calm him down. Instead, she fueled the fire. She leaned across the table, her face flushed with fury. She pointed an accusing finger at me, detailing all the perceived slights and injustices I had supposedly inflicted upon them over the years. She called me a tyrant. She said I was a tight-fisted manipulator who used his comfortable retirement to make them feel inferior. Howard and Cynthia simply watched, their silence acting as a silent endorsement of the verbal slaughter. The psychological line had been thoroughly, completely crossed. They had stripped away the final veneer of familial respect and revealed the pure, venomous greed underneath. I did not raise my voice to match theirs. I simply sat there, letting their hateful words wash over me, committing every insult to memory. I told Monica that she was out of line. I calmly reminded Bradley that I had heavily subsidized his failing logistics business for the past 5 years, keeping him out of bankruptcy court. I stated that my generosity had reached its absolute limit. My calm demeanor shattered Monica's remaining fragile control. The absolute rejection of her demands, the realization that I would not break under their combined pressure, severed her connection to rational thought. She snatched her heavy crystal goblet from the table. The glass was filled to the brim with dark red wine. With a sudden violent scream, she hurled the heavy crystal directly at my head. I had no time to raise my hands to defend myself. The heavy base of the goblet struck me squarely on the right cheekbone just below my eye. The impact was sickeningly loud. The crystal shattered upon striking my facial bone, sending sharp shards flying across the dining table. A blinding flash of pain erupted behind my eyes, followed immediately by the warm, thick rush of blood. The dark red wine splashed across my face, my white dress shirt, and the wall behind me. The heavy silence slammed back into the room, instantly replacing the shouting. Howard let out a strangled gasp. Cynthia covered her mouth in horror. Bradley froze, his eyes widening as he stared at the gruesome result of his wife's violent temper. He did not move to help me. He did not reprimand his wife. He simply took a slow, cowardly step backward. Monica stood there, chest heaving, staring at her empty hand, as if she did not understand what she had just done. I did not scream. I did not curse. The pain throbbing in my face brought a strange, terrifying clarity to my mind. I slowly stood up from the table. I reached into my pocket and retrieved a pristine white linen handkerchief. I pressed it firmly against the deep, bleeding laceration on my cheekbone, feeling the fabric instantly saturate with my own blood. I looked at Bradley. I looked at Monica. I let them see the absolute cold void in my eyes. I turned my back on my family and walked out of the dining room. I walked through the front door, stepping out into the cool, dark evening, leaving their shattered illusions and the ruined Easter dinner behind me. I walked to my car parked in their driveway. My hands were perfectly steady as I unlocked the door and slid behind the leather steering wheel. The metallic taste of blood and the bitter tang of red wine coated my lips. I started the engine and pulled out onto the street. I did not drive toward my house. I steered my vehicle toward the county hospital. The streetlights flashed in a rhythmic pattern, illuminating the dark interior of the car, and the bloody cloth held against my face. Every throb of pain in my cheek solidified my resolve. The simmering conflict had finally boiled over into undeniable physical violence. They had given me the ultimate weapon. I parked my car in the brightly lit emergency room parking lot. I did not immediately get out. I pulled my mobile phone from my jacket pocket and dialed the private number of Jonathan Pierce, my corporate litigator and oldest confidant. The phone rang twice before Jonathan answered, his voice sharp and alert despite the late hour. I did not bother with pleasantries. I spoke clearly into the receiver, my voice echoing in the quiet car. I told Jonathan that Phase 1 was complete. I informed him that the assault was physical, that Monica had struck me in the face with a heavy glass object, and that I was currently bleeding in the parking lot of the emergency hospital. Jonathan did not ask for unnecessary details. He simply stated that he was activating the protocols we had discussed and advised me to ensure the medical staff documented everything perfectly. I ended the call. I stepped out of the car into the harsh fluorescent glare of the hospital entrance. I walked through the automatic sliding doors, approaching the triage desk with deliberate, measured steps. The nurse behind the counter looked up and gasped at the sight of my blood-soaked face and ruined shirt. I stood tall, maintaining my dignity. I told her in a clear, calm voice that I required immediate medical attention for a facial laceration. I then instructed her to contact the local police precinct immediately because I needed to file a formal felony assault report against my daughter-in-law. The silent adjustment had officially begun, and the paper trail was now permanently sealed. I did not return to my empty house that night. Jonathan Pierce arranged a private suite for me at a downtown hotel, ensuring my safety, while the legal machinery ground into motion. The next morning, I sat in the sleek, glass-walled office of my lawyer, sipping black coffee while my stitched cheek throbbed with a dull, steady pain. Jonathan did not offer empty sympathies. He simply turned his laptop toward me and pressed play on a video file. It was the police body camera footage from the previous night. I watched the events unfold with a cold, detached satisfaction. The footage showed two uniformed officers walking up the manicured pathway to the suburban house belonging to Bradley and Monica. Through the large front window, the camera captured a scene of domestic tranquility. Bradley, Monica Howard, and Cynthia were sitting around the dining table eating gourmet cheesecake. They were laughing and clinking their dessert forks, completely unbothered by the fact that they had just sent me to the hospital bleeding. They believed they had won. They thought my silence was a surrender. They had no idea that a warrant for felony assault with a deadly weapon had already been signed by a night court judge. The lead officer pounded his heavy fist against the solid oak front door. The loud, rhythmic thud shattered the peaceful atmosphere inside the house. On the screen, I saw Bradley frown and wipe his mouth with a napkin. He stood up looking annoyed rather than concerned. He likely assumed I had returned to beg for forgiveness or to negotiate the terms of my own surrender. He walked confidently to the door and pulled it open, ready to deliver another lecture on my selfishness. Instead, he found himself face to face with two large county sheriffs. The flashing red and blue lights from their patrol vehicles parked on the street painted his pale face in alternating colors. Bradley puffed out his chest, attempting to project authority. He asked the officers what they wanted and demanded to know why they were disturbing his family late at night. The lead officer did not flinch. He did not offer a polite greeting. He simply looked past Bradley into the brightly lit dining room and demanded that Monica step forward and identify herself. Monica froze halfway through a bite of cheesecake. Her arrogant smirk vanished instantly, replaced by a mask of sudden, genuine panic. She placed her fork down with a trembling hand and slowly stood up. Bradley immediately moved to block the doorway, positioning himself between his wife and the officers. He puffed his chest further and stated that his wife had done nothing wrong. He told the police that they were responding to a simple family misunderstanding that had been blown completely out of proportion by an emotional old man. The lead officer ignored Bradley completely. He stepped heavily across the threshold, forcing Bradley to stumble backward to avoid being knocked over. The second officer followed closely behind, his hand resting casually but firmly on his utility belt. They walked straight into the dining room, bringing the cold reality of the law directly into the pristine sanctuary Monica had built. Howard and Cynthia shrank back into their chairs, their faces drained of all color. The scavengers suddenly realized they were trapped in a cage with predators far more dangerous than they were. The lead officer addressed Monica by her full legal name. He did not ask for her side of the story. He read directly from the warrant securely clipped to his tactical vest. He stated that she was being placed under arrest for aggravated assault with a deadly weapon and felony elder abuse. Monica let out a high-pitched shriek. She took a step backward, bumping into the expensive mahogany table and knocking over a water glass. She screamed that it was a lie and that I had attacked her first. She demanded that Bradley do something to stop them. Bradley grabbed his mobile phone, threatening to call the mayor and the police commissioner. The officers remained entirely unmoved by their frantic, wealthy entitlement. The lead officer reached out and firmly grasped Monica by the wrist. He twisted her arm behind her back with practiced efficiency. The metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs locking around her wrists echoed sharply in the quiet room. It was a beautiful, definitive sound. Monica began to sob uncontrollably, her designer dress wrinkling as she struggled against the unyielding grip of the officer. The officers marched Monica out of the dining room, dragging her toward the front door. She dragged her feet, pleading and crying loudly, begging Bradley to save her. Bradley followed them to the porch, shouting empty legal threats that the officers ignored. The neighborhood was wide awake. The flashing police lights had drawn the attention of every affluent resident on the street. Neighbors stood on their manicured lawns and peered through their front windows, watching the spectacle unfold. They saw Monica, the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood association, being shoved into the back of a police cruiser in handcuffs, with her mascara running down her face. Her reputation was instantly and permanently destroyed. The doors of the cruiser slammed shut, cutting off her hysterical screams. The officers climbed into the front seats and drove away, leaving Bradley standing alone on his front lawn, bathed in the harsh security lights. Howard and Cynthia remained hiding inside the house, too cowardly to step outside and support their daughter. Watching the footage in the quiet law office, I felt no pity. I felt only the precise mechanical satisfaction of a trap closing exactly as designed. The morning sun poured heavily through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the law office, casting long, sharp shadows across the polished concrete floor. The heavy oak door was securely shut, sealing us away from the chaotic noise of the city below. I sat in a high-backed black leather chair, holding my mobile phone in the palm of my hand. The digital screen displayed 12 missed calls and 3 unheard voice messages. Every single notification was from my son. Jonathan sat across the wide mahogany desk, his posture immaculate, his hands folded neatly over a fresh yellow legal pad. He instructed me to place the phone in the center of the desk and activate the speaker function so we could formally document the exact nature of the communications. I tapped the glass screen, and the quiet room suddenly filled with the sharp, automated voice of the messaging system. The first message was recorded at 2 a.m. Bradley sounded completely out of breath, his voice echoing slightly in what was clearly the cavernous, sterile waiting room of the county jail. He did not ask how my injured face was healing. He did not ask if the doctors had given me painkillers. He immediately launched into a frantic, entitled tirade. He demanded that I pick up the phone and stop acting like a dramatic child. He said that the police had actually booked Monica and that she was currently sitting in a holding cell with common criminals. He ordered me to drive down to the precinct immediately, tell the duty sergeant that I had tripped and hit my own face on the table, and drop all the charges. He insisted that this was a massive overreaction and that I was intentionally ruining their lives over a simple accident. He told me to stop embarrassing the family and fix my mistake. The message ended with a heavy, angry click. Jonathan made a single, slow note on his pad. I felt absolutely nothing. The second message arrived exactly 45 minutes later. The tone had shifted entirely from commanding arrogance to desperate, unhinged rage. Bradley was practically shouting into the receiver, the background noise of the police station now completely drowned out by his fury. He screamed that the night magistrate had set an enormous cash bail because the charge was officially classified as a violent felony against a vulnerable elderly person. He blamed me entirely for the extreme financial hardship this bail payment would cause them. He said that I was a spiteful, vindictive old man who could not stand to see his own son happy and successful. He threatened that if I did not fix this situation by sunrise, I would never be allowed to speak to them again. He promised to cut me out of their lives completely and leave me to rot away alone in my massive, empty house. He told me that Howard and Cynthia were deeply traumatized by the police raid, and that I was a complete monster for doing this to innocent people. I looked across the desk at Jonathan. He raised a single eyebrow, assessing the legal value of the threat, but he remained completely silent. The final message was left just after 6 a.m. The background noise was the muffled, vibrating hum of a car engine. Bradley had finally posted the bail money. Monica could be heard crying hysterically in the passenger seat, her loud, piercing sobs dominating the terrible audio quality. Bradley was no longer shouting. His voice was completely flat, incredibly cold, and dripping with pure, concentrated malice. He told me that they were driving home and that the gloves were officially off. He stated clearly that I had crossed an unforgivable line and declared war on my own flesh and blood. He promised that he would make me suffer for publicly humiliating his wife. He said that he was going to call his own legal team and prove to a judge that I was mentally unfit to live alone. He swore that he would have me dragged out of my home and locked away in a miserable state facility for the demented. He explicitly stated that he would take full control of my estate, sell the property, and use the money to pay for Monica to avoid prison. He ended the message by telling me that I was dead to him. The phone went completely silent. Jonathan reached across the desk and tapped the screen, saving the audio files directly to his secure server. He looked up at me, his eyes sharp and fiercely calculating. He stated plainly that Bradley had just handed us the exact criminal intent we needed. The silence that followed the final voice message was profound. The echo of Bradley screaming his violent threats hung in the quiet air of the law office like toxic smoke. He honestly believed he held all the power in our dynamic. He believed that I was nothing more than a frail, isolated old man sitting on a single valuable asset. In his arrogant mind, he was the wealthy, successful businessman, and I was the pathetic burden standing in the way of his ultimate financial freedom. He genuinely thought his logistics franchise made him a titan of industry and a self-made millionaire. The absolute delusion of his perspective would have been comical if his intentions were not so deeply malicious. Jonathan Pierce did not say a word to interrupt my thoughts. He simply reached down and unlocked the heavy bottom drawer of his mahogany desk. He pulled out a thick black leather binder and placed it carefully on the desk between us. This binder did not contain my medical directives or my basic retirement accounts. It contained the complete operating agreements and private financial ledgers for Summit Commercial Management. I am not simply a comfortable retiree living on a modest fixed pension. I spent 40 grueling years acquiring, developing, and managing premium commercial real estate across the entire state. I built a highly lucrative empire quietly and methodically, operating entirely behind the impenetrable walls of corporate trusts and holding companies. When my wife passed away, I chose to live a simple, unassuming life in our family home. I drove an older, reliable car and wore practical clothes because I had nothing left to prove to anyone. Bradley, however, interpreted my quiet lifestyle as weakness and financial stagnation. He assumed the wealth I had accumulated over my lifetime was insignificant. Jonathan opened the heavy black binder and turned to the central section. He smoothed out a crisp legal document and turned it toward me. It was the master commercial lease agreement for a massive industrial warehouse complex located on the busy southern edge of the city. This was the exact facility from which Bradley operated his supposedly booming logistics company. 5 years ago, Bradley had marched into my living room wearing an expensive tailored suit he could not actually afford. He demanded a massive cash loan from me to start his own delivery and warehousing business. He spoke to me with incredible condescension, claiming he was a natural entrepreneur, and that my conservative financial advice was outdated and useless. I refused to hand him a giant sum of liquid cash because I knew his extreme arrogance would bankrupt him within a single year. However, I still loved my son back then. I still wanted him to succeed and build a stable life. So I orchestrated a silent intervention. I purchased the enormous warehouse complex through one of my anonymous shell corporations. I then instructed Summit Commercial Management to offer Bradley a miraculously cheap long-term commercial lease. For half a decade, I have been his absolute and invisible lifeline. The actual market rate for a commercial warehouse of that size and premium location is $40,000 a month. Bradley pays exactly $8,000 a month. Every single month for 5 entire years, I have been quietly absorbing a massive $32,000 deficit through my holding company just to keep his fragile ego intact and his chaotic business out of bankruptcy court. Bradley boasts loudly at expensive country clubs about his brilliant profit margins and his incredible business acumen. He buys Monica diamond necklaces and leases luxury European sports cars, operating under the complete delusion that he is a financial genius. He has absolutely no idea that his entire corporate empire is a fragile paper castle built entirely on my silent charity. His actual logistics business is failing miserably. Without my invisible financial injections, his company would have been liquidated by ruthless creditors years ago. Jonathan picked up a silver pen and tapped the bottom paragraph of the master lease. He pointed directly to the stringent morality and default clauses we had intentionally embedded deep within the original contract. Because Bradley believed he had outsmarted a desperate corporate landlord, he had hurriedly signed the extensive paperwork without ever having a competent lawyer read the fine print. He had foolishly agreed to a strict clause that allowed the landlord to execute an immediate and uncontested termination of the lease in the event of any violent criminal charges brought against the primary tenant or their immediate family members. By allowing Monica to violently assault me and subsequently get arrested for a felony, Bradley had legally triggered the absolute destruction of his own company. He had signed his own financial death warrant, and he did not even know the executioner was sitting in the room. I looked down at the sloppy, arrogant signature of my son on the bottom of the page. He wanted to declare me mentally unfit. He wanted to use a corrupt medical injunction to force me out of my own home so he could sell my sanctuary to pay for his violent wife to avoid a prison sentence. He wanted to destroy me completely. I looked up at Jonathan and delivered my instructions with absolute freezing clarity. I told him to draft the immediate eviction notice and the complete lease termination documents. I instructed him not to send them through the postal service or via email. I wanted the documents printed on premium heavy stock paper and placed in a sealed, unmarked envelope. I would carry the weapon myself. I would deliver his absolute financial ruin personally when the time was perfectly right. The invisible lifeline that had kept him afloat for 5 years was now officially and permanently severed. I remained in the hotel for 2 more days, letting the silence stretch and the anxiety fester in the mind of my son. I knew Bradley. I knew his arrogance would not allow him to accept defeat gracefully. He was backed into a corner, terrified of the criminal charges facing his violent wife and the impending financial collapse I had secretly set in motion. A desperate man is a dangerous man, but he is also entirely predictable. On the 3rd morning, a sharp, heavy knock echoed through my hotel suite. I opened the door to find a man in a cheap gray suit holding a thick manila envelope. He asked to confirm my identity. When I nodded, he shoved the envelope aggressively against my chest, stated that I had been officially served, and quickly walked away down the carpeted hallway. I carried the heavy package to the small desk by the window. I broke the wax seal and pulled out a massive stack of legal documents stamped with the bold red seal of the county probate court. Bradley had not backed down or shown remorse. He had chosen to weaponize the legal system against me. I spread the papers across the desk, reading through the dense legal jargon with cold, detached amusement. Bradley had filed an emergency petition for a temporary medical conservatorship. He was officially asking a judge to strip away my basic human rights and hand him total control over my life and my finances. The narrative he constructed in the petition was a masterpiece of malicious fiction. He claimed that I was suffering from severe and rapidly advancing dementia. He stated under penalty of perjury that I had become deeply paranoid and prone to terrifying bouts of self-inflicted violence. The most sickening part of his petition was how he twisted the traumatic events of our Easter dinner. He wrote that Monica had not attacked me. He claimed that I had suffered a massive psychotic break, picked up the heavy crystal wine glass, and smashed it into my own face while screaming abuse at them. He painted himself as the tragic, exhausted son, desperately trying to protect his severely ill father from harming himself and others in the community. To grant an emergency order, the court requires immediate medical proof. Bradley had anticipated this requirement. Attached to the back of the petition was a sworn medical affidavit signed by a licensed psychiatrist. I recognized the name of the doctor immediately. He was a frequent guest at the lavish, expensive dinner parties Monica used to host. He was a man with expensive tastes and a widely known gambling problem. This corrupt medical professional had signed a binding legal document diagnosing me with severe cognitive decline and violent psychosis without ever having examined me or spoken a single word to me. He had sold his medical license and his professional integrity to help my son steal my life. Because the affidavit claimed I was an immediate physical danger to myself, the judge had granted a temporary 14-day emergency injunction. The immediate consequences of this temporary order were explicitly detailed on the final page of the packet. Bradley had been granted temporary power of attorney over my healthcare decisions and my personal financial assets. A secondary document from my primary retail bank was attached. My personal checking and savings accounts, the ones holding my monthly pension and basic living expenses, had been completely frozen. Bradley had effectively cut off my access to my own money, believing he could starve me out and force me into total submission. He thought he had successfully neutralized me. He believed that without my checking account, I would not be able to hire a competent defense attorney or even pay for my hotel room. He assumed I would be forced to crawl back to my house completely at his mercy. I picked up my mobile phone and called Jonathan Pierce. I read the precise details of the temporary injunction aloud to him. Jonathan did not sound alarmed or worried. He sounded exactly like a hunter, watching his prey step willingly into a steel trap. He explained that Bradley and the corrupt psychiatrist had just committed blatant perjury and federal medical fraud. By filing these fraudulent documents with the probate court, they had escalated their actions from a simple domestic dispute to a highly complex criminal conspiracy. I asked Jonathan about the frozen bank accounts. I needed to ensure that the massive wealth held within my commercial management company remained completely undetected. Jonathan assured me that the corporate trusts were entirely separate legal entities protected by thick layers of corporate armor that Bradley did not even know existed. Bradley had only managed to freeze the insignificant decoy accounts I used to pay for groceries and electricity. I stood by the window looking down at the busy city streets below. My stitched face throbbed with a dull ache, but my mind was completely clear and focused. Bradley believed he was holding a winning hand. He thought he had trapped me in a legal cage and severed my financial lifeline. He did not realize that I had deliberately left the door open for him. I had allowed him to take this temporary power because I knew exactly what a greedy, desperate man would do with it. He would not just stop at freezing my modest accounts. He would attempt to use that new legal power to steal something much larger. He would attempt to leverage my assets to save himself, sealing his own fate completely. The retaliation was exactly what I had waited for. The stage was now perfectly set for the Trojan horse. I returned to my property the following afternoon. The heavy iron gates parted smoothly, allowing my car to glide up the long driveway. My house stood exactly as I had left it, a sprawling stone estate surrounded by manicured lawns and ancient oak trees. It was my private sanctuary built with decades of my own sweat and calculation. But today the air felt entirely different. Today the sanctuary was a battlefield. I parked my car in the garage and walked into the grand foyer. I did not have to wait long. Less than an hour after I arrived, the grating sound of a heavy engine shattered the quiet afternoon. I stood by the large front window and watched Bradley park his oversized luxury sports utility vehicle directly on my pristine front lawn. He did not care about the deep tire tracks he was leaving in the grass. He stepped out of the vehicle, projecting an aura of absolute triumph. The passenger doors opened, and Howard and Cynthia emerged. They were dragging several large, cheap plastic suitcases behind them. They stopped and stared up at the massive stone facade of my home, their eyes wide with unrestrained greed. They looked like scavengers preparing to feast on a fresh carcass. I walked away from the window and unlocked the heavy mahogany front door, pulling it open, just as Bradley reached the top step. Bradley did not bother to greet me. He did not ask how I was feeling or inquire about the bandages still covering the right side of my face. He simply held up a thick manila folder and pushed past me into the foyer. Howard and Cynthia followed closely behind him, dragging their loud plastic wheels across my polished marble floors. I closed the door quietly and turned to face them. Bradley slapped the legal folder down on my antique console table. He announced with supreme arrogance that the court had granted him full temporary control over my life. He stated that a judge had determined I was a severe danger to myself and that I could no longer be trusted to live alone. He then turned and gestured grandly to his bankrupt in-laws. He declared that Howard and Cynthia were moving in immediately to provide around-the-clock medical supervision. He said they were doing me a massive favor by giving up their own time to watch over a sick, paranoid old man. It was a brilliant, terrifying lie. He was moving two destitute strangers into my home to act as his personal wardens, ensuring I could not mount a legal defense while he drained my frozen bank accounts. Howard puffed out his chest and looked around the grand foyer with a sickening smile. He told me not to worry and that they would take excellent care of the property while my mind continued to deteriorate. Cynthia was already tracing her fingers over a priceless bronze sculpture, whispering to herself about how much it might fetch at a private auction. They expected me to scream. They expected me to fight back, to threaten them, or to try and physically throw them out of my house. Bradley stood with his feet planted firmly apart, bracing himself for the violent outburst he had falsely described to the judge. I gave them absolutely nothing. I knew that the greatest weapon I possessed was their own profound underestimation of my intellect. I let my shoulders slump forward. I allowed a slight visible tremor to enter my hands. I looked down at the marble floor, avoiding their eyes entirely. When I finally spoke, I kept my voice weak and raspy, perfectly mimicking the exact picture of a defeated, broken old man. I told Bradley that I was simply very tired. I muttered that my head hurt constantly and that I just wanted to rest in my own bed. I did not argue against the court order. I did not demand that Howard and Cynthia leave my property. I simply nodded my head slowly and turned away from them. I shuffled my feet slightly as I walked, acting confused and deeply disoriented by the medication the hospital had supposedly given me. The transformation was flawless. I could hear the immediate shift in the room behind me. The tense defensive posture of the scavengers instantly dissolved into cruel, mocking relief. Bradley let out a loud, arrogant laugh. He told Howard and Cynthia to take the guest suites on the east wing and make themselves completely at home. He instructed them to lock all the exterior doors and to make sure I did not wander outside and embarrass the family again. He spoke about me as if I were a deaf dog sleeping on the floor. He believed his legal maneuver had completely broken my spirit. He honestly thought the sight of his official court document had crushed the last remaining ounce of fight left in my old bones. I slowly climbed the grand sweeping staircase, my hand gripping the wooden banister tightly. I kept my head bowed and my steps heavy until I reached the top landing. I walked down the long, silent hallway to my private master suite. I stepped inside the heavy oak door and pushed it shut behind me. The solid metallic click of the deadbolt locking into place was the most satisfying sound I had heard all week. The moment the lock engaged, the frail, defeated old man vanished completely. I stood up straight, my spine rigidly aligned. I walked over to the heavy velvet curtains and pulled them tightly shut, plunging the massive room into cool shadows. I walked to my private mahogany desk and opened the false bottom drawer. I pulled out a sleek encrypted tablet device. The invasion was completely successful. They had breached the walls of my sanctuary and planted their flags in my living room. They believed they were the conquering army moving in to claim the spoils of an easy war. They had no idea they had just locked themselves inside a highly sophisticated trap. The game of patience had officially begun, and I was ready to watch them destroy themselves. They were utterly blind to the reality of the walls surrounding them. I pressed the power button on the tablet and watched the screen glow with the cold, hard light of absolute, undeniable surveillance. The soft blue glow of the encrypted tablet illuminated the dark corners of my master suite. I sat in my heavy leather armchair, listening to the muffled sounds of heavy footsteps echoing from the floor below. Howard and Cynthia were busy exploring their new domain, completely unaware that the ground beneath their feet did not actually belong to me. Bradley believed his emergency conservatorship had handed him the ultimate prize. He thought he had successfully seized my multi-million-dollar estate, securing a massive financial asset he could eventually liquidate to save his wife from prison. His entire strategy relied on the assumption that I was a foolish old man who kept his greatest treasure sitting unprotected in plain sight. He was spectacularly wrong. 6 months ago, I had noticed a subtle shift in Bradley. I saw the way his eyes lingered on my antique silver collection, and the way he casually asked probing questions about my property taxes and life insurance policies. I recognized the greedy, desperate hunger of a failing man looking for an easy bailout. I did not wait for him to strike. I drove to the city and sat down with Jonathan Pierce to build an impenetrable fortress around my legacy. We executed a complex and entirely legal transfer of assets. I officially relinquished my personal ownership of the entire estate. The deed, the title, and every legal right to the property were quietly transferred into an irrevocable blind trust managed entirely by Jonathan and a board of independent corporate trustees. When the corrupt judge signed the temporary medical injunction, he gave Bradley control over Gordon Wallace, the individual. He gave him the power to freeze my modest personal checking accounts and dictate my daily medical care. But Gordon Wallace, the individual, no longer owned the sprawling stone mansion or anything inside it. Bradley had essentially stormed a massive castle only to discover that the vault was empty and the real owner was a faceless corporation immune to his petty family court orders. He could not sell the house. He could not leverage it for a loan. He could not even legally evict me because my residency was permanently guaranteed by the ironclad stipulations of the trust. He was celebrating a hollow victory, holding a meaningless piece of paper, while standing on territory he could never truly conquer. But I needed more than just a legal shield. I needed a weapon. I needed undeniable objective proof of their malicious intent to present to a federal judge. During the same week we established the blind trust, I hired a private security firm specializing in high-end corporate espionage. They did not install cheap plastic cameras that flash obvious red lights. They spent 4 days hardwiring a state-of-the-art surveillance grid directly into the architectural bones of my home. The lenses were microscopic and entirely undetectable. They were seamlessly integrated into the custom crown molding, the ventilation grates, and the recessed lighting fixtures in every single room except the private bathrooms. Every camera recorded in brilliant 4K high-definition video and captured crystal-clear audio. Because the house was legally owned by a corporate entity, and the cameras were installed in common living areas, the surveillance was entirely legal and completely admissible in a court of law. There was no expectation of privacy in the grand foyer, the kitchen, or the formal living room of a corporate-owned property. I had effectively turned my own home into a massive high-definition soundstage, perfectly designed to capture the true nature of the predators who had invaded it. I swiped my finger across the glass screen of the tablet. The primary security application opened, demanding a complex biometric password. I pressed my thumb against the sensor. The application accepted my fingerprint and instantly divided the large screen into a grid of 16 live video feeds. The dark, silent master suite faded into the background as the vibrant, high-definition reality of my house sprang to life in the palms of my hands. The trap was fully operational. I watched the intricate details of my home rendered in perfect clarity. The camera in the main hallway showed the cheap plastic suitcases still sitting carelessly against the expensive silk wallpaper. I focused my attention on the feed from the formal living room. Howard and Cynthia were standing by the massive stone fireplace. Howard was holding a bottle of my most expensive vintage scotch, examining the label with a greedy, wide-eyed expression. He broke the wax seal and poured a generous measure into a crystal tumbler, not bothering to ask for permission or even look over his shoulder. He drank it like water, completely unappreciative of its immense value. Cynthia was pacing back and forth across the expensive Persian rug, dragging her fingers over the smooth mahogany surface of my antique grand piano. She was speaking animatedly, gesturing toward the large bay windows, and discussing which walls they should knock down to modernize the space and increase the resale value. I tapped the screen to isolate the audio feed from the living room. Cynthia's sharp nasal voice filled my dark bedroom. She was openly mocking my supposed mental decline, laughing about how easily Bradley had outsmarted me. She told Howard that they would finally have the luxury retirement they deserved once I was locked away in a state facility. Howard laughed heartily, raising his stolen glass of scotch in a mocking toast to my failing health. They spoke with the absolute unvarnished cruelty of people who believe they are completely alone and totally victorious. They had no idea that every hateful word, every arrogant laugh, and every stolen sip of liquor was being instantly digitized, encrypted, and beamed directly to a secure remote server managed by Jonathan Pierce. I sat in the darkness, watching them perform for my hidden audience. I did not feel angry. I did not feel betrayed. I felt only the profound, freezing calm of an architect watching the final piece of a magnificent bridge slide perfectly into place. The invasion was not a defeat. It was the crucial final phase of my strategy. I leaned back in my heavy leather chair, keeping my eyes locked on the glowing grid of the tablet. I was ready to let them dig their own graves as deeply as they possibly could. The silent adjustment was moving exactly according to plan. The first night under my own roof as a supposed prisoner was deeply revealing. I remained seated in my darkened master suite, keeping my eyes firmly locked on the glowing screen of the security tablet. The heavy oak door of my bedroom was locked from the inside, but I could hear the faint muffled sounds of their movement echoing through the massive house. Howard and Cynthia had finished their stolen scotch and were now beginning their true work. They were no longer simply admiring the architecture. They were actively hunting. I switched the camera feed to the main corridor leading toward my private library. The high-definition night vision lens captured their creeping figures with terrifying clarity. They moved with the practiced stealth of professional thieves, whispering to each other as they tested the brass handles of every closed door. They believed I was heavily medicated and fast asleep, allowing them free rein to pillage my legacy. Cynthia pushed open the heavy double doors of the library and stepped inside. Howard followed closely behind her, his eyes scanning the floor-to-ceiling mahogany bookshelves. They did not care about the rare first editions or the centuries of history lining the walls. They were looking for easily concealable liquid assets. The library camera zoomed in perfectly, capturing the greedy gleam in Cynthia's eyes as she approached my antique writing desk. She began pulling open the heavy wooden drawers, tossing my personal papers carelessly onto the expensive Persian rug. Her hands moved frantically, searching for anything of immediate value. She let out a sharp gasp of delight when she opened the bottom drawer. Inside rested a velvet display box containing a solid gold vintage pocket watch that had belonged to my grandfather. It was a priceless family heirloom engraved with my family crest. Cynthia did not hesitate. She plucked the heavy gold timepiece from its velvet bed and held it up to the light. She whispered to Howard that the solid gold casing alone was worth thousands of dollars, and that a private pawnbroker she knew downtown would ask absolutely no questions. She slipped the watch directly into the deep pocket of her cardigan, stealing a piece of my family history without a second thought. Howard was equally busy on the other side of the room. He had discovered a locked glass display cabinet containing my collection of rare silver coins. He did not bother looking for the key. He grabbed a heavy bronze paperweight from the desk and used the edge to carefully pry the delicate lock open. He scooped handfuls of the heavy silver coins into a canvas tote bag he had brought downstairs. Every metallic clink, every whispered calculation, and every blatant act of grand larceny was captured in brilliant 4K resolution. After thoroughly looting the library, they moved into the formal dining room. I tapped the screen, switching the feed to the camera hidden perfectly within the crystal chandelier hanging above the long dining table. Howard and Cynthia sat down at the table, spreading out the silver coins and the gold watch like pirates dividing their plunder. Cynthia leaned forward, her face twisted into a mask of pure, calculated malice. She told Howard that taking these small items was only the beginning. She explicitly laid out their grand strategy. She said that Bradley had assured them the temporary conservatorship would become permanent within 2 weeks. Once the judge signed the final order, they planned to move me into a miserable state-funded facility on the poorest side of the city. Cynthia laughed coldly, stating that the cheaper the nursing home was, the more money they would have left over from the sale of my estate. Howard nodded in eager agreement. He pulled a small notebook from his pocket and began running the numbers. He calculated the estimated market value of my home, the value of the antique furniture, and the potential balance of the frozen checking accounts. He stated clearly that once I was locked away, they would convince Bradley to give them a massive cut of the profits to fund their own permanent luxury retirement. They were actively conspiring to strip me of my dignity, my freedom, and my entire life savings. They spoke with absolute impunity, believing that there were no witnesses to their cruelty. They did not know that the microscopic microphone above their heads was recording every single syllable with terrifying precision. I listened to them discuss my forced institutionalization with the casual indifference of people discussing taking out the trash. I did not feel a shred of the weakness I had portrayed earlier that afternoon. The cold anger in my chest hardened into absolute iron. I pressed the record button on the tablet, saving the video and audio files directly to the secure cloud server monitored by Jonathan Pierce. The evidence was undeniable. This was no longer a simple family dispute. This was a documented conspiracy to commit grand theft, elder abuse, and extreme financial fraud. Howard and Cynthia had just provided me with the exact ammunition required to send them to a federal penitentiary. The beauty of the blind trust was that they were stealing from a corporate entity, which elevated their petty theft to massive corporate larceny. I watched them pack up their stolen goods and turn off the dining room lights, heading back to their luxurious guest suites to sleep peacefully in my stolen beds. I turned off the tablet screen and plunged my bedroom back into total darkness. I laid down on my bed, not to sleep, but to wait for the morning. The trap had successfully captured the scavengers. Now Adisitplau needed to wait for Bradley to make his own fatal mistake and complete the final piece of the puzzle. The sun had barely crested the horizon when I stepped out of my master suite. The massive house was completely silent. Howard and Cynthia, exhausted from their night of pillaging my library and drinking my expensive liquor, were sleeping soundly in the luxurious guest wing. I walked down the grand, sweeping staircase, leaning heavily on the wooden banister, maintaining the physical illusion of a broken old man, just in case they were watching from a cracked door. I walked across the cold marble floor of the foyer and opened the heavy front door, stepping out into the crisp morning air. My destination was the large brick mailbox standing at the very end of my long, winding driveway. Bradley had instructed his in-laws to watch my every move, but scavengers are inherently lazy. They lacked the discipline to wake up at dawn. I reached the end of the driveway and pulled open the heavy iron door of the mailbox. Inside, resting on top of the usual catalogs and utility bills, was a thick priority mail envelope from a prominent national commercial bank. It was addressed directly to Bradley Wallace, with my home address listed as his primary financial residence. I slipped the thick envelope inside the deep pocket of my wool robe. I walked slowly back up the driveway, my posture hunched, my steps deliberate and entirely deceptive. I re-entered my home and locked the front door behind me. I climbed the stairs and returned to my private sanctuary, turning the heavy deadbolt with a satisfying metallic click. I walked over to my mahogany desk and turned on the small brass reading lamp. I retrieved the envelope from my pocket and carefully sliced it open with a silver letter opener. I spread the crisp official documents across the smooth leather surface of my desk. It was a formal notification of loan approval and immediate fund disbursement. I traced my finger down the columns of numbers and legal clauses, feeling a cold, sharp smile form on my lips. Bradley had not wasted a single second. The moment the corrupt judge handed him the temporary medical conservatorship, he had marched directly into a major financial institution to execute his ultimate theft. The document outlined a massive commercial line of credit. $200,000 had been officially approved and electronically wired directly into the primary operating account of his failing logistics franchise. He desperately needed that massive injection of cash to keep his bankrupt company afloat and to pay the exorbitant legal fees for Monica and her impending felony trial. But a bank does not simply hand $200,000 to a failing business without securing a rock-solid guarantee. I turned to the second page of the document to examine the collateral agreement. There, printed in bold black ink, was the precise address of my estate. Bradley had used the emergency court order to pledge my multi-million-dollar home as the sole collateral for his desperate business loan. He honestly believed he was a financial genius. He thought he had exploited a brilliant legal loophole. He assumed that because the temporary power of attorney gave him control over my personal finances, he automatically had the absolute right to leverage my real estate. He pictured himself as the victorious king, securing his crumbling empire with the stolen bricks of my legacy. He had sat in a leather chair across from a careless loan officer, presented his fraudulent medical injunction, and confidently signed his name to a binding federal contract. He was entirely blind to the massive, inescapable trap he had just bolted shut around his own ankles. The fatal flaw in his brilliant plan was the simple, undeniable reality of the blind trust. The temporary conservatorship only granted him authority over the assets held directly in the name of Gordon Wallace the individual. But Gordon Wallace the individual did not own the house. The estate was legally owned by Summit Corporate Holdings, a completely separate and heavily protected corporate entity. Bradley had walked into a federally insured bank and legally pledged a massive piece of commercial real estate that he did not own and had absolutely no legal authority to encumber. He had intentionally lied on a federal loan application. By signing those documents, he had officially committed massive bank fraud. By accepting the electronic transfer of $200,000 across state lines to fund his business, he had triggered the severe federal statute for wire fraud. These were not petty civil disputes or minor family disagreements. These were severe federal felonies carrying mandatory minimum prison sentences. Bradley had escalated his greed from simple elder abuse to a massive financial crime that the federal government ruthlessly prosecutes. He had handed me the exact weapon I needed to completely destroy his life and salt the earth where his logistics company once stood. He had done all the heavy lifting for me, locking himself inside a prison cell of his own making. I picked up my encrypted tablet and activated the high-resolution camera. I carefully photographed every single page of the banking documents, ensuring the signatures, the loan amounts, and the fraudulent collateral descriptions were perfectly legible. I attached the secure images to an encrypted message and sent it directly to Jonathan Pierce. I typed a single, simple instruction to my lawyer. I told him that the bank fraud was complete and that it was officially time to involve the federal authorities. I turned off the reading lamp and sat in the quiet shadows of my bedroom. My stitched face no longer throbbed with pain. It felt completely numb, replaced by the absolute freezing certainty of my impending victory. The scavengers were waking up downstairs, preparing to spend another day stealing my silver and planning my funeral. They had absolutely no idea that their entire world was about to be violently, legally, and permanently eradicated. I slipped out of the house just before noon. I did not use the heavy front door. I exited through the glass conservatory at the rear of the estate, moving with absolute silent precision. Howard and Cynthia were sitting on the back patio, loudly demanding that my private landscaper trim the rose bushes to their liking. They were completely absorbed in their new delusions of grandeur, barking orders at a man whose salary I paid. I walked down the hidden gravel path that led directly to the private service gate. My driver was waiting for me in an unmarked black sedan, idling quietly on the adjacent street. I climbed into the back seat and instructed him to take me directly to the financial district. The facade of the broken old man was temporarily suspended. I sat up straight, straightening the cuffs of my tailored suit. I was no longer the victim trapped in my own home. I was the architect traveling to meet my generals. The private elevator opened directly into the heavily secured conference room of Jonathan Pierce. This was not a space designed for polite conversation. It was a windowless, soundproof room dominated by a massive black granite table and a wall of digital monitors. Jonathan was waiting for me. Sitting beside him was a man in a sharp charcoal suit with cold, calculating eyes. Jonathan introduced him as Vincent, an elite forensic accountant who specialized in dismantling corrupt corporate structures and tracing hidden financial crimes. Vincent did not offer a warm smile or a sympathetic handshake. He simply nodded respectfully and pointed to the glowing screens. The war room was fully operational, and the absolute destruction of my family was currently being digitized and categorized. Jonathan pressed a button on his remote, and the largest monitor flared to life. He played the high-definition security footage from my library and dining room. We stood in silence, watching the undeniable reality of Howard and Cynthia pillaging my estate. We watched Cynthia pocket the solid gold pocket watch. We watched Howard pry open the display case and steal the rare silver coins. Vincent typed rapidly on his keyboard, cross-referencing the stolen items with the master insurance manifest of my trust. He calculated the exact market value of the stolen gold and silver, verifying that the total amount easily exceeded the state threshold for felony grand larceny. Jonathan printed the high-resolution screenshots of their faces, illuminated by the stolen silver. He placed the photos into a thick red folder. Howard and Cynthia were no longer just arrogant house guests. They were officially documented thieves waiting to be prosecuted. The second monitor displayed the grim legal reality facing my violent daughter-in-law. Jonathan had pulled the official court records from her late-night arraignment. Monica was currently free on a massive cash bail, but the conditions of her release were incredibly strict. Jonathan ran his finger down the highlighted legal text. Because the charge was a violent felony against an elderly family member, the judge had issued a mandatory restraining order. Monica was legally prohibited from coming within 100 feet of me or engaging in any threatening behavior. If she violated this order, even by a single aggressive step, her bail would be instantly revoked. She would not be given a second chance or a fine. She would be immediately arrested and thrown directly into the county jail to await her trial behind bars. Jonathan printed the official bail conditions and added them to the growing red folder. Monica was standing on a trapdoor, and she was completely blind to the lever. The third and final monitor held the centerpiece of our strategy. Vincent brought up the highly encrypted images of the commercial bank loan I had intercepted that morning. This was the lethal blow. Vincent dissected the loan document with the surgical precision of a seasoned investigator. He pointed to the exact clause where Bradley had knowingly pledged my corporate-owned estate as personal collateral. Vincent explained the precise mechanics of the federal wire fraud statute. By authorizing the electronic transfer of $200,000 based on a fraudulent medical injunction and a fabricated real estate claim, Bradley had triggered a mandatory federal investigation. He had stolen money from an institution insured by the federal government. Vincent printed the loan application, the forged collateral agreement, and the bank transfer receipts. He stamped each document with a bold, black seal of verification. Jonathan gathered the thick stacks of printed evidence from the black granite table. He arranged them in a very specific, calculated order. First, he placed the evidence of the theft committed by the in-laws. Next, he placed the strict bail conditions hanging over Monica. Finally, he placed the undeniable proof of federal bank fraud committed by my son. He slid the documents into a heavy leather binder, binding them together into a single devastating weapon. This was not a defense strategy. This was an absolute execution order. The red folder contained the permanent destruction of their freedom, their finances, and their entire future. Jonathan closed the heavy leather binder and looked across the table at me. He stated that we had everything we needed to initiate the final arrests. He asked me how I wanted to deliver the fatal blow. I placed my hands flat against the cool granite surface of the table. I did not want to simply hand the folder to the police and let them handle it quietly. I wanted Bradley to feel the exact same public humiliation he had inflicted upon me. I wanted Monica to be dragged away in front of her high society friends. I told Jonathan that we were going to wait for the perfect audience. I instructed him to prepare the local sheriff deputies and the federal agents for a coordinated strike. I would return to my home and continue playing the role of the broken prisoner until Bradley built the stage for his own public execution. The weapon was fully loaded. Now I simply needed to hand them the rope. I returned to my estate under the cover of dusk, slipping back into my master suite before the scavengers even realized I had been gone. The heavy oak door was secured once again, returning me to my role as the helpless captive. The house was quieter this evening. Howard and Cynthia had likely exhausted themselves with their thievery and retired early to their stolen luxury. I sat in the darkness of my room, the heavy leather binder from Jonathan Pierce resting securely inside my hidden floor safe. The weapon was forged and waiting. I only needed Bradley to provide the perfect stage for his own execution. I did not have to wait long. Heavy, confident footsteps echoed in the hallway outside my bedroom. They stopped directly in front of my locked door. The faint rustle of heavy gloss paper broke the silence. A brightly colored brochure slid underneath the gap of my door, stopping just inches from my leather shoes. I did not reach down to pick it up immediately. I simply stared at it, while the arrogant voice of my son bled through the heavy wood. Bradley did not bother to knock. He leaned close to the door, speaking in a low, theatrical whisper, designed to maximize his cruelty. He told me to take a long, careful look at the pamphlet. He announced that he had spent the entire afternoon touring my permanent new residence. He sounded incredibly proud of himself, convinced that his masterstroke of legal manipulation was finally complete. Bradley described the state-run facility with sadistic detail. He told me it was located on the far industrial edge of the county, right next to the municipal water treatment plant. He laughed as he described the lingering smell of chemicals and the cramped shared bedrooms. He explicitly stated that the facility only accepted the absolute lowest tier of state funding, which meant the food was essentially processed mush and the staff were violently overworked. He told me that my new roommate was a nonverbal man who screamed at the bare walls all night. Bradley was not just sending me away to hide his theft. He was actively trying to punish me for daring to survive his wife's assault. He wanted me to suffer in complete isolation, stripped of my dignity, my wealth, and my perfectly manicured gardens. His voice grew harsher as he laid out the final phase of his pathetic strategy. He reminded me that Monica was facing her preliminary criminal hearing at the end of the week. He stated that by the time she stood before the judge, the permanent medical conservatorship would be finalized. Once he held total legal authority over my voice, he intended to formally withdraw my police statement. He planned to tell the court that my memory was entirely fractured and that the assault was merely a hallucination of a diseased mind. He believed he could single-handedly erase her felony charges by erasing my legal competence. He gloated that with the $200,000 loan he had secured against my house, he had already retained the most expensive criminal defense lawyer in the city. He proudly confessed to his own bank fraud through the locked door, believing I was too stupid to understand the massive financial implications of his words. He told me to pack a single small suitcase because the state facility did not allow personal furniture or large wardrobes. He said he was bringing a moving crew in 3 days to clear out my bedroom and begin staging the house for a rapid commercial sale. He imagined out loud how much money the estate would fetch on the open market, and how perfectly that cash would fund his failing logistics company. He ended his monologue by telling me that this was the absolute consequence of my selfishness. He said that if I had simply allowed his bankrupt in-laws to move in peacefully, none of this would have happened. He walked away down the hallway, his footsteps heavy with unearned victory. I waited until the sound of his footsteps completely faded before I bent down and picked up the glossy brochure. The cheap paper depicted a depressing gray brick building surrounded by a tall chain-link fence. The printed slogan promised basic, essential care for the elderly. I walked over to my desk and turned on the small brass lamp. I did not feel fear or despair as I looked at the miserable future my son had planned for me. I felt the profound, icy satisfaction of a man holding a winning lottery ticket. Bradley had just confirmed his entire criminal timeline. He had admitted his plan to obstruct justice in a federal proceeding by falsifying medical records to manipulate a violent felony trial. I placed the brochure carefully on my desk, right next to my encrypted tablet. I tapped the screen, opening the secure communication channel to Jonathan Pierce. I sent a single text message outlining the strict 3-day deadline Bradley had just established. The real estate staging and the final celebration of his perceived triumph would be the absolute perfect venue for his destruction. I instructed Jonathan to finalize the guest list for our counter-ambush. Bradley wanted to sell my house and lock me in a state asylum. Instead, he had just booked himself a permanent suite in a federal penitentiary. The nursing home threat was not a weapon against me. It was the final nail he drove into his own coffin. The third day arrived exactly as my arrogant son had promised. By late afternoon, the tranquil silence of my private estate was violently shattered by a coordinated invasion. I stood by the second-floor window of my master suite, watching a fleet of commercial catering trucks and luxury event planners occupy my long, winding driveway. Men in crisp white uniforms carried massive exotic floral arrangements, crates of imported champagne and heavy lighting equipment through my wide-open front doors. Bradley and Monica were sparing absolutely no expense. They were pulling out all the stops to celebrate their fabricated victory and cement their new status among the city elite. They had invited their entire social network, including wealthy, shallow friends, prominent business associates, and fellow members of their exclusive country club. They were hosting a grand high society housewarming party in a massive stone estate they did not own to celebrate a vast wealth they had systematically stolen. The heavy thumping of bass from a live band began to vibrate through the floorboards just as the sun began to set. Heavy, deliberate footsteps approached my bedroom door. The brass handle turned, but the solid oak remained firmly shut because my deadbolt was engaged. I walked over, unlocked the mechanism, and pulled the door open. Bradley stood in the hallway wearing a brand-new bespoke tuxedo that fit him perfectly. He looked me up and down with an expression of profound, unvarnished disgust. He did not see a father. He saw a pathetic, embarrassing obstacle. He told me that his very important guests were beginning to arrive, and that he could not risk a mentally unstable old man wandering downstairs and ruining the aesthetic of the evening. He ordered me to stay absolutely silent, to keep my television turned off, and to not even think about knocking on the door. He explicitly stated that if I caused any kind of scene or upset Monica during her special celebration, he would personally ensure my immediate physical transfer to the miserable state asylum before midnight. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of expensive scotch, and told me to enjoy the sound of my betters, enjoying my former life. Without waiting for a single word of response, he reached out, grabbed the heavy brass handle, and forcefully pulled the door shut. A second later, I heard the unmistakable heavy metallic click of an exterior padlock sliding into a hastily installed latch. My own son had physically bolted me inside my bedroom. He had literally turned my private sanctuary into a locked holding cell so he could parade around my elegant living room without the inconvenient reminder of the man he was currently destroying. I did not pound on the heavy wood. I did not shout for help. I simply turned around, walked over to my mahogany desk, and activated the encrypted tablet. The 16 high-definition security feeds instantly illuminated the dark walls of my room. The visual transformation of my ground floor was sickeningly lavish and entirely paid for by federal bank fraud. The formal mahogany dining table where my blood had been spilled just days earlier was now covered in towering tiered displays of beluga caviar and raw oysters on crushed ice. A live jazz quartet was set up in the corner of the grand foyer, playing smooth, sophisticated background music over the loud, arrogant chatter of nearly 100 wealthy guests. I tapped the screen to focus the main camera on Monica. She was wearing a stunning, incredibly expensive designer gown, her wrists heavily layered with sparkling diamond bracelets. These were the immediate fruits of the $200,000 fraudulent commercial loan Bradley had secured against my corporate trust. She was holding court in the exact center of the formal living room, laughing loudly and graciously accepting lavish compliments on her magnificent new home. She showed absolutely no remorse for the violent felony hanging directly over her head. She believed the incredibly expensive criminal defense lawyer Bradley had just retained had completely neutralized the threat of a prison sentence. She felt utterly untouchable, floating on a cloud of stolen money and profound delusion. I switched the audio feed to the open bar area. Howard and Cynthia were mingling effortlessly, acting as if they possessed a lifetime of generational wealth. Cynthia was wearing my late wife's vintage pearl necklace, a priceless piece of jewelry she had shamelessly scavenged from a locked vanity drawer during her first night of looting. She was proudly telling a captive audience of local politicians about her extensive, brilliant plans to completely gut and renovate the historic estate. Howard was handing out premium cigars from my private humidor, boasting loudly about his lucrative real estate investments. The sheer magnitude of their collective delusion was utterly fascinating to observe in high definition. They were dancing joyfully on the deck of a rapidly sinking ship, celebrating their own manufactured brilliance, while the cold, dark water rushed in just below their feet. I watched Bradley wrap his arm around Monica, raising a crystal flute of imported champagne to toast their bright, limitless future. The arrogance of the scavengers had officially reached its absolute peak. The stage was now flawlessly set. The precise high society audience I required for their public execution was fully assembled, holding their expensive drinks and paying very close attention. The time for waiting and gathering evidence was permanently over. It was finally time for the architect to step out of the shadows and tear down the paper castle they had built inside my home. Bradley truly believed that a cheap piece of metal purchased from a local hardware store could successfully imprison me inside a fortress I had designed and built from the ground up. He had forcefully slid the exterior padlock into place, assuming that my silence was a sign of absolute defeat. He did not know that when I commissioned the construction of this estate, I had mandated the installation of high-security fire safety mechanisms in every primary bedroom. The heavy oak door of my master suite was equipped with a concealed internal override switch designed to instantly disengage any external locking hardware in the event of an emergency. I walked over to the edge of the heavy wooden door frame and ran my fingers along the smooth custom molding. I found the small hidden depression in the wood and pressed it firmly. A sharp mechanical click echoed inside the wall, followed immediately by the sound of the heavy exterior padlock disengaging and dropping uselessly against the brass handle. My prison was instantly unlocked. I did not open the door immediately. I turned away and walked into my expansive, cedar-lined walk-in closet. For months I had dressed in faded, oversized cardigans, worn-out khaki trousers, and scuffed orthopedic walking shoes. I had intentionally wrapped myself in the pathetic uniform of a fragile, forgotten old man to feed their endless arrogance. I reached up and pulled that entire wardrobe entirely off the racks, letting the cheap fabric fall into a careless pile on the floor. I walked to the very back of the deep closet, to a section I had kept carefully concealed behind heavy garment bags. I reached past the dust covers and withdrew a bespoke three-piece charcoal gray suit that had been custom-tailored for me in Milan. I selected a crisp, brilliant white dress shirt made of heavy Egyptian cotton and a deep crimson silk tie. I moved to my master bathroom and turned on the bright vanity lights. I washed my face with cold water, carefully avoiding the fresh stitches resting high on my right cheekbone. I looked at my reflection in the wide mirror. I no longer looked like a victim. I pulled the crisp white shirt over my shoulders, fastening the heavy pearl buttons with perfectly steady hands. I tied the crimson silk tie into a flawless knot, adjusting it until it sat perfectly against my collar. I stepped into the tailored charcoal trousers and buttoned the sleek-fitted vest over my chest. Finally, I slipped my arms into the heavy wool jacket, feeling the familiar weight of genuine power settle securely across my shoulders. The suit was my armor. It was the absolute visual representation of the ruthless corporate architect I had been for 40 years. I looked at the dark purple bruising and the sharp black stitches on my face. Against the pathetic cardigans, the wound had looked like a mark of tragic elder abuse. Against the sharp lines of the bespoke suit, it looked exactly like the battle scar of a man who had just survived an assassination attempt and was currently walking to his own retaliation. I stepped out of the bathroom and walked back toward the door. I bypassed my usual comfortable footwear and stepped into a pair of highly polished black leather Oxford shoes. I adjusted my cuffs, ensuring that a precise half-inch of white fabric extended beyond the dark wool sleeves. I was completely transformed. The fragile old widower was dead. Gordon Wallace, the corporate titan, had officially returned to reclaim his territory. I reached out and pulled the heavy oak door open. The broken padlock swung wildly on its hinge, entirely useless. I did not walk toward the grand sweeping staircase in the center of the house. I knew that descending into the grand foyer would immediately alert the hundreds of guests and give Bradley precious seconds to formulate a defense. I needed total surprise. I moved silently down the long carpeted hallway toward the rear of the second floor. I opened a narrow, inconspicuous door that led to the secondary servants' staircase. This enclosed wooden stairwell was designed for the invisible movement of household staff, and it bypassed the main living areas entirely. I descended the steep, narrow steps, walking with the silent, measured pace of a hunting leopard. The heavy thumping bass of the live jazz band vibrated violently through the narrow wooden walls. I could hear the roar of 100 wealthy guests drinking my expensive liquor and laughing at the jokes of my arrogant son. The sheer volume of their celebration provided the perfect acoustic cover for my descent. I reached the ground floor and stepped out into a dark, narrow service corridor located just behind the main coat room. I was standing mere feet from the grand foyer, hidden completely in the shadows. I could see the bright flashing lights of the party reflecting off the polished marble floors just beyond the corridor wall. I checked a secondary luxury watch strapped to my left wrist. It was exactly 8 o'clock in the evening. The timing was absolute perfection. I walked past the coat room and stepped directly into the grand entrance vestibule. The massive double front doors were closed, sealing the loud party inside the estate. Through the frosted glass side panels, I saw the distinct heavy silhouettes of several large vehicles pulling silently into my long circular driveway. There were no flashing red and blue police lights to give away their approach. This was a calculated stealth arrival designed specifically to trap the targets before they could run. I reached out and grasped the heavy brass handles of my own front doors, pulling them wide open to the cool night air. Standing on my expansive front porch, illuminated by the soft amber glow of the exterior carriage lights, was my personal execution squad. Jonathan Pierce stood dead center wearing a sharp navy blue suit, holding a thick, heavy leather briefcase containing the absolute destruction of my family. Standing immediately to his left were 2 towering county sheriff deputies wearing dark green tactical uniforms with heavy-duty utility belts strapped to their waists. Their faces were carved from stone, entirely devoid of any sympathy. Standing to his right was a man wearing a plain, nondescript gray suit with a gold federal badge clipped prominently to his belt. He was the senior agent from the Financial Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Jonathan looked at my bespoke suit and the cold, calculated expression on my scarred face. He did not say a word. He simply gave me a single, slow nod of absolute confirmation. The trap was fully loaded. The authorities were present. The audience was perfectly captive inside my living room. I stepped back smoothly, holding the heavy front door open wide, inviting the harsh, unyielding reality of the law directly into the heart of their arrogant celebration. I stepped through the massive double doors and crossed the threshold of my own home. The transition from the cool night air into the suffocating heat of the crowded foyer was instant. The air was thick with the smell of expensive perfume and roasted meats. I walked past the shocked catering staff who were carrying trays of champagne. I did not look at them. My eyes were fixed entirely on the live jazz quartet playing in the corner of the grand living room. I walked with deliberate, heavy steps across the polished marble floor. The crowd of wealthy guests naturally parted around me, their conversations faltering as they noticed the severe expression on my scarred face and the impeccable tailoring of my charcoal suit. I reached the small raised platform where the musicians were performing. I looked directly at the saxophone player and gave a single sharp shake of my head. The musician stopped playing immediately. The bass player and the pianist followed suit seconds later. The sudden absence of music created a massive, unnatural vacuum in the center of the party. The loud, arrogant chatter of the high society crowd died down into a confused, uncomfortable murmur. Hundreds of eyes turned to stare at me. From the center of the room, the crowd parted to reveal my son. Bradley was holding a crystal glass of scotch, his face flushed with alcohol and irritation. He stomped toward me, his expensive tuxedo wrinkling with his angry, frantic movements. He had not yet noticed the uninvited guests waiting silently in the shadows of the vestibule. He only saw his supposedly broken father defying his explicit orders. He stopped 3 feet away from me, his chest heaving with manufactured outrage. He raised his voice intentionally, projecting his words so that every single wealthy guest could hear his reprimand. He demanded to know what I was doing downstairs. He asked me if I had completely lost my mind and forgotten the rules he had just established. He pointed a trembling finger at my face and told the entire room that I was suffering from severe dementia and was prone to violent outbursts. He apologized loudly to his friends, claiming that my condition was deteriorating rapidly and that I was entirely unmanageable. Monica appeared beside him, her diamond bracelets sparkling under the crystal chandelier. She crossed her arms and let out a loud, dramatic sigh of pure disgust. She told Bradley to call the private medical transport company immediately. She announced to the silent room that they had tried their absolute best to care for me, but that I clearly needed to be institutionalized tonight for my own safety. Bradley nodded eagerly, agreeing with his wife. He took a threatening step closer to me, his breath reeking of liquor. He ordered me to turn around and march directly back to my locked bedroom before he physically dragged me up the stairs himself. He told me that my pathetic attempt to ruin his perfect evening had failed and that I was nothing more than a humiliating burden to the family. He smiled a cruel, arrogant smile, fully believing he had successfully asserted his absolute dominance in front of his peers. He waited for me to lower my head and shuffle away in defeat. I did not move a single muscle. I did not break eye contact. I stood perfectly still, letting the absolute silence of the room amplify his foolish threats. Then I took a single deliberate step to my right. The heavy rhythmic sound of tactical boots striking the marble floor echoed through the grand foyer. The crowd gasped in collective horror as 2 massive county sheriff deputies stepped out of the dark vestibule and into the bright light of the living room. They did not look like friendly neighborhood patrolmen. They were dressed in dark green tactical gear, their hands resting casually but firmly on their heavy-duty equipment belts. They walked past the terrified guests, taking up strategic positions flanking the main exit. Following closely behind them was the federal agent, his gray suit a stark contrast to the tuxedos and evening gowns surrounding him. The shiny gold badge of the Financial Crimes Division was clipped prominently to his belt, catching the light of the chandelier. The arrogant smile vanished from Bradley completely. His face drained of all color, leaving him looking like a sick, terrified ghost. He dropped his crystal glass. It shattered against the marble floor, spilling expensive scotch across the polished stone. Monica let out a sharp, terrified gasp and instinctively stepped backward, trying to hide behind her husband. The wealthy guests began to whisper frantically, exchanging panicked glances as they suddenly realized their elegant housewarming party was being raided by federal authorities. Jonathan Pierce walked smoothly into the room, carrying his heavy leather briefcase. He moved with the absolute predatory grace of a man who destroys lives for a living. He walked directly past Bradley, completely ignoring his existence, and stood next to me. He unbuttoned his navy blue suit jacket and turned to face the terrified crowd. He did not yell. He spoke in a calm, deep, authoritative voice that easily carried to the very back of the massive room. He introduced himself as the senior corporate counsel for Summit Commercial Holdings, the legal entity that owned the estate they were currently standing in. He announced that the party was officially permanently over. He instructed the catering staff to immediately cease serving alcohol and told the band to pack their instruments. He then turned his cold, calculating gaze directly onto my son. Bradley opened his mouth to speak, to offer some pathetic, arrogant excuse or legal threat, but Jonathan simply raised his hand, silencing him instantly. Jonathan stated clearly that the building was now an active federal crime scene and that absolutely no one was permitted to leave until the authorities had completed their initial arrests. He took complete and absolute control of the room, stripping Bradley of his fake kingdom in a matter of seconds. The slaughterhouse doors were locked, and the butchers were ready to work. The silence in the grand living room was absolute and terrifying. The live jazz band stood perfectly still, holding their instruments awkwardly, while the 100 wealthy guests held their collective breath. Jonathan Pierce did not waste a single second of this manufactured tension. He moved with the surgical precision of a man who had orchestrated this exact sequence 100 times in his mind. He walked directly to the massive 85-inch television mounted securely above the grand stone fireplace. He pulled a small black digital device from the interior pocket of his navy blue suit and plugged it directly into the auxiliary port of the television. The massive screen instantly flashed from a resting black void to a brilliant high-definition blue. Bradley stood frozen in the center of the room, the shattered glass of his crystal Scotch tumbler still resting in pieces at his feet. He stammered loudly, demanding to know what Pierce was doing to his television. Pierce ignored him completely. He tapped the glowing screen of his encrypted tablet, and the massive television immediately mirrored his private display. In the back of the room near the expensive open bar, Howard and Cynthia finally realized the crushing gravity of the situation. The confident, wealthy facade they had been projecting to the local politicians evaporated instantly. Howard whispered frantically to his wife, grabbing her aggressively by the arm. They tried to quietly slip away from the bar, attempting to move toward the rear patio doors, hoping to vanish into the dark night before the authorities noticed them. One of the towering sheriff deputies anticipated their cowardly movement. He stepped smoothly into their path, placing a heavy leather-gloved hand on the glass handle of the patio door. He stared down at them, his expression completely blank, and shook his head once. They were trapped. They were physically forced to turn around and face the massive screen illuminating the center of the room. Pierce pressed play on his tablet. The high-definition night vision footage filled the 85-inch screen, rendering the pitch-black darkness of my private library in perfect, terrifying clarity. The 100 high society guests gasped in unison as they watched the towering digital figures of Howard and Cynthia creeping across my expensive Persian rug like common street burglars. The audio was crystal clear, capturing every single greedy, breathless whisper. The entire room watched in absolute stunned silence as Cynthia pulled open my antique writing desk drawer, her eyes wide with manic excitement. They heard her exact words, her sharp nasal voice echoing heavily through the premium living room surround sound speakers as she lifted my grandfather's solid gold pocket watch. They heard her openly brag to her husband about taking the priceless family heirloom to a shady downtown pawnbroker. The footage cut seamlessly to the other side of the library. Now the captive audience watched Howard. The local politicians who just minutes ago had been listening to Howard boast endlessly about his brilliant real estate investments now watched him use a heavy bronze paperweight to violently pry open my locked glass display cabinet. The sharp metallic crack of the lock breaking echoed violently through the silent party. They watched him scoop handfuls of my rare silver coins into a cheap canvas tote bag, laughing under his breath. The public humiliation radiating through the room was palpable. The high society guests physically recoiled, shifting their weight away from Howard and Cynthia, as if the destitute in-laws carried a highly contagious, deadly disease. Pierce did not stop there. He tapped his tablet again, and the footage transitioned to the brilliant color video captured from the dining room chandelier. This was the absolute killing blow. It was one thing to be publicly exposed as a petty thief, but it was another thing entirely to be exposed as a heartless monster. The wealthy guests watched Howard and Cynthia sitting comfortably at my dining table, dividing their stolen plunder like pirates. The sensitive microphone picked up Cynthia's cruel, mocking laughter perfectly. Her voice filled the crowded room, explicitly detailing their grand strategy to lock me away in a miserable, underfunded state facility. She bragged loudly to Howard about how Bradley was going to forcefully sell my estate and use the money to fund their luxury retirement, while I rotted away in a cramped shared bedroom next to the water treatment plant. The wealthy crowd was deeply, profoundly disturbed. These were people who valued reputation and social standing above absolutely everything else in the world. They were currently watching a raw, unedited display of pure human rot. A prominent city councilwoman, who had been graciously complimenting Cynthia's vintage pearl necklace just moments before, loudly expressed her absolute disgust. Cynthia instinctively reached up and covered the stolen pearls resting against her collarbone, her face flushing a deep, humiliating crimson. Howard simply stared at the marble floor, his entire body trembling violently, unable to meet the eyes of the prominent men he had been desperately trying to impress all evening. They were completely stripped of their false dignity. They were utterly exposed as destitute scavengers who had attempted to feed off an old man they incorrectly assumed was defenseless. Monica watched the screen with her mouth hanging open in pure horror. She looked at her parents and then looked at the disgusted faces of her wealthy friends. The high society life she had violently clawed her way into was disintegrating before her very eyes. Pierce paused the video, freezing the massive screen on an incredibly unflattering image of Howard grinning greedily over his stolen silver coins. Pierce turned his body slowly to face the two sheriff deputies standing by the patio doors. He stated in a clear, highly professional tone that the two individuals currently cowering by the exit had committed documented felony grand larceny. He informed the deputies in front of the entire silent room that the stolen solid gold pocket watch was currently residing in the right pocket of Howard's suit jacket. He added that the stolen vintage pearl necklace was currently clasped tightly around Cynthia's neck. Pierce officially requested acting as the senior legal representative of the corporate trust that owned the property and the stolen items that the deputies immediately recover the stolen goods and execute a formal arrest. The trap had sprung flawlessly, completely destroying their reputations before the handcuffs even left the belts of the officers. The two sheriff deputies moved with practiced efficiency. They escorted the weeping Cynthia and the trembling Howard toward the vestibule, stripping them of their stolen dignity and the stolen jewelry right in front of the stunned crowd. With the scavengers removed, the oppressive silence in the living room focused entirely on my son. Bradley stood alone in the center of his ruined celebration. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously above his crimson bow tie. He attempted to salvage the unsalvageable. He forced a pathetic, nervous laugh and addressed the wealthy guests, claiming he had absolutely no idea his in-laws were capable of such horrific behavior. He tried to physically distance himself from their crimes, stepping away from his wife and looking directly at Jonathan Pierce. He puffed out his chest and tried to assert the fake authority he believed he still possessed. He told Pierce that while he appreciated the security intervention, the lawyer was wildly out of line for crashing a private event. Bradley loudly reminded everyone that he held a court-ordered emergency conservatorship. He declared that he was the legal master of the estate and demanded that Pierce and the remaining federal agent leave his property immediately. Pierce did not flinch. He did not raise his voice to match Bradley. He simply placed his heavy leather briefcase flat onto the nearest marble side table and unlatched the brass locks. The sharp click echoed across the silent room. Pierce withdrew a thick stack of crisp legal documents bound by a heavy blue seal. He walked slowly toward Bradley, holding the papers out for the entire room to see. Pierce stated in his freezing authoritative tone that Bradley was operating under a massive, profound delusion. He explained that the emergency conservatorship only granted temporary authority over the personal assets of Gordon Wallace, the individual. Pierce paused, letting the absolute silence amplify his next sentence. He announced that Gordon Wallace, the individual, had not owned this property for over 6 months. Bradley blinked rapidly, his arrogant expression faltering as his brain struggled to process the legal terminology. Pierce handed the top document directly to Bradley. It was the master deed of the estate. Pierce instructed him to read the name of the legal owner printed in bold black ink. Bradley looked down at the paper, his hands beginning to shake violently. He read the words, Summit Commercial Holdings. Pierce explained to the captivated audience that the estate, the antique furniture, and every single blade of grass on the property belonged to an irrevocable corporate blind trust. Bradley was holding a meaningless piece of paper. He had assumed absolute control over an empty vault. The realization hit Bradley like a physical blow, but Pierce was not finished. The destruction of my son required absolute, total finality. Pierce reached back into his briefcase and retrieved a second, highly encrypted document. It was the commercial loan agreement I had intercepted from the mailbox that very morning. Pierce held the loan document up beside the corporate trust deed. He asked Bradley if he remembered walking into a federally insured bank 3 days ago. He asked if he remembered signing a legally binding contract to secure a massive line of credit for his failing logistics franchise. Bradley opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving him the color of dirty ash. He took a staggering step backward, bumping into the grand piano. Pierce did not let him breathe. He read the exact terms of the loan aloud to the silent room. He stated that Bradley had accepted an electronic transfer of $200,000. He then read the collateral agreement, where Bradley had explicitly pledged my private estate as the sole guarantee for the massive sum. Pierce lowered the papers and looked Bradley dead in the eyes. He stated with brutal clarity that pledging a corporate asset you do not own and have absolutely no legal authority to encumber is not a simple misunderstanding. It is a severe premeditated federal crime. A collective gasp rippled through the gathered crowd. The wealthy business owners and local politicians immediately understood the catastrophic magnitude of the accusation. Bank fraud was an unforgivable sin in their circles. They began backing away from Bradley as if the marble floor beneath his feet was suddenly collapsing. The federal agent in the gray suit finally stepped forward. He moved with the heavy, inevitable weight of the United States government. He bypassed Pierce and walked directly up to my son. The agent did not offer a polite greeting. He looked at Bradley with absolute professional contempt. He stated his name and his agency, identifying himself as a senior investigator for the Financial Crimes Division. The agent announced that he was executing an immediate arrest warrant for massive bank fraud, wire fraud, and the fabrication of federal loan documents. Bradley completely collapsed inward. The wealthy, successful businessman facade shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. He dropped the legal documents onto the floor and raised his hands in a frantic, pleading gesture. He looked past the federal agent directly at me. He begged me to tell them it was a mistake. He pleaded with me to pay off the bank loan and make the federal agent go away. He called me his father, tears streaming down his face, completely forgetting the miserable nursing home brochure he had shoved under my door just hours earlier. I looked at him, my face completely devoid of any emotion. I told him that I was simply a sick, paranoid old man, and that I had absolutely no idea what he was talking about. I gave him back the exact cold indifference he had shown me when my face was bleeding at his dining table. The federal agent grabbed Bradley roughly by the shoulder, spinning him around. The agent kicked Bradley's legs apart, forcing him into a humiliating spread-eagle stance right in the middle of his own lavish party. The sharp, metallic, ratcheting sound of heavy steel handcuffs locking securely around his wrists echoed through the grand living room. The bespoke tuxedo jacket stretched awkwardly, pinning his arms painfully behind his back. The federal agent began reading Bradley his Miranda rights in a loud, clear voice, completely drowning out his pathetic sobbing. The high society guests watched in absolute stunned silence as the golden boy of their country club was physically restrained like a common violent criminal. His logistics company was dead. His reputation was permanently eradicated. His future was confined to a federal prison cell. The trap had closed perfectly around his neck. The heavy steel handcuffs securing my son were the final brutal reality check for the high society crowd. But my work in that grand living room was still not completely finished. Bradley was standing with his head bowed, his bespoke tuxedo twisted awkwardly around his restrained arms, weeping openly as the federal agent read him his rights. The guests were completely silent, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the legal destruction happening right in front of the catering tables. I turned my back on my sobbing son and shifted my focus entirely to my daughter-in-law. Monica was standing near the towering floral arrangements, her face pale and her eyes wide with frantic terror. She was watching her husband, the supposedly brilliant entrepreneur, being processed as a federal criminal. She slowly realized that without his fabricated income, her entire luxurious lifestyle was actively evaporating into thin air. She looked at me, hoping to find a shred of the weak, compliant old man she had bullied for years. She found only the cold, unyielding stare of the architect who had engineered her absolute ruin. I walked slowly across the polished marble floor, closing the distance between us. The crowd parted instinctively, giving me a wide, unobstructed path to the woman who had violently scarred my face just 3 days earlier. I reached inside the breast pocket of my charcoal suit and withdrew the crisp, sealed envelope Jonathan Pierce had prepared for me. I held it in my right hand, feeling the heavy premium paper. I stopped exactly 3 feet away from her, standing just outside the physical boundary mandated by her strict bail conditions. I did not raise my voice, but the absolute silence of the room ensured that every single wealthy guest heard my words perfectly. I asked Monica if she truly believed her husband was a self-made millionaire. I asked her if she honestly thought the failing logistics franchise he ran could actually afford the diamond bracelets she was currently wearing, or the luxury sports cars sitting in my driveway. Monica stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. She could not comprehend why I was asking her about their finances while her husband was in handcuffs. I did not wait for her to formulate a pathetic lie. I turned slightly so the captive audience could hear the final devastating truth. I announced that 5 years ago I had quietly purchased the massive commercial warehouse complex that housed Bradley's entire operation. I revealed that I was the anonymous corporate landlord operating entirely behind the walls of Summit Commercial Management. I explained to the shocked crowd of local politicians and business owners that the actual market rent for that massive facility was $40,000 a month, but I had secretly allowed my son to pay only $8,000. I stated clearly that every single month for half a decade, I had personally subsidized their arrogant, lavish lifestyle to the tune of $32,000. I told Monica that she was not a high society queen. She was the unknowing recipient of my silent, exhausting charity. The absolute humiliation hit Monica with the force of a physical blow. The wealthy friends she had desperately tried to impress were now staring at her with profound, unvarnished pity and disgust. The illusion of her superiority was completely, permanently shattered. I held out the heavy sealed envelope and dropped it onto the marble floor directly at her expensive designer heels. I told her that the envelope contained the immediate and absolute termination of the commercial warehouse lease. I explained the strict morality clause buried deep within the contract her foolish husband had signed. I stated that because she had violently assaulted the primary shareholder of the management company and was subsequently arrested for a felony, the lease was legally voided. I informed her that the warehouse doors were currently being padlocked by private security. Their logistics company was instantly completely bankrupt. They had absolutely no assets, no income, and nowhere to go. Monica looked down at the white envelope resting on the floor. Her mind could not process the absolute totality of her destruction. Within the span of 10 minutes, she had lost her wealthy parents to grand larceny charges, her husband to federal bank fraud, and her entire financial foundation to a single piece of paper. The psychological break was instantaneous and violent. The sheer magnitude of her public humiliation overrode every single instinct of self-preservation she possessed. She forgot the crowded room. She forgot the federal agent. Most importantly, she completely forgot the strict mandatory conditions of her felony bail release. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unhinged, demonic rage. She let out a high-pitched, blood-curdling scream that echoed violently off the high ceilings of the estate. She lunged forward, her manicured hands hooked like claws, aiming directly for the fresh stitches on my face. She intended to tear my eyes out right in front of 100 witnesses. She did not even make it 2 feet. The 2 towering county sheriff deputies who had just finished escorting her parents outside had re-entered the grand foyer. They reacted with terrifying speed and absolute overwhelming force. Before Monica could even brush the fabric of my suit, one deputy hit her from the side, tackling her violently to the hard marble floor. The impact was sickeningly loud. The crystal champagne flutes on the nearby tables rattled violently. Her expensive designer gown tore instantly, and the heavy diamond bracelets she had paraded around all evening snapped, sending loose diamonds scattering across the polished stone. The second deputy dropped his heavy knee squarely onto her back, pinning her firmly against the floor. He grabbed her wrists and twisted them painfully behind her back, pulling out a fresh pair of heavy steel handcuffs. The metallic ratcheting sound echoed for the second time that night. The deputy leaned down, placing his face inches from her ear. He announced in a booming voice that she was under immediate arrest for the blatant violation of her felony bail conditions and for attempting to assault a protected victim. He stated that her bail was permanently revoked, and she would be transported directly to the maximum security county jail to await her trial behind bars. Monica thrashed wildly against the marble floor, screaming obscenities and crying hysterically, completely ruining her expensive makeup and her fragile high society reputation. She was dragged to her feet by the 2 massive officers, her dress ruined, her dignity gone, and her freedom permanently erased. I stood perfectly still, adjusting the cuffs of my bespoke suit, watching the deputies drag my violently screaming daughter-in-law out the front doors and into the cold, dark night. The eviction was complete, and the poison was finally purged from my home. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers painted the high ceilings of my grand foyer. I stood perfectly still, watching the heavy vehicles back out of my winding driveway and disappear into the dark night, carrying my son and daughter-in-law toward their new reality. The luxurious housewarming party had completely evaporated. The wealthy guests had fled the moment the federal agent produced his handcuffs, leaving behind half-eaten plates of caviar and shattered glass. The live jazz band had packed their instruments and vanished through the service exit. The only people remaining in the vast, silent living room were Jonathan Pierce, myself, and the 2 terrified scavengers who had orchestrated this entire nightmare. I turned away from the open front doors and locked my eyes onto Howard and Cynthia. They were huddled together near the cold stone fireplace, trembling like frightened mice caught in the glaring light of a trap. Their stolen confidence had been entirely stripped away. Cynthia was clutching the collar of her cheap cardigan, where my late wife's vintage pearl necklace used to rest. Howard was staring at the marble floor, his hands empty and shaking. They had watched their daughter dragged away screaming and their son-in-law arrested for federal bank fraud. They knew with absolute certainty that they were standing at the edge of their own total destruction. I walked slowly toward them, my leather shoes clicking sharply against the polished stone. I stopped just a few feet away, allowing my imposing presence in the bespoke suit to completely dominate their shrinking figures. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the cold, calculated precision of a judge delivering a final sentence. I told them that the solid gold pocket watch and the silver coins they had attempted to steal belonged to a corporate trust insured for millions of dollars. I explained that stealing from that trust constituted a massive felony, carrying a mandatory state prison sentence for grand larceny. Cynthia began to sob, a pathetic, high-pitched sound of pure desperation. She opened her mouth to beg for forgiveness, to claim it was all a terrible misunderstanding. I raised a single finger, silencing her instantly. I told her that I had absolutely no interest in her tears or her pathetic excuses. I raised my left arm and pulled back the crisp white cuff of my shirt, exposing the face of my luxury watch. I told them they had exactly 10 minutes. I instructed them to walk up the stairs to their luxurious guest suites and pack only the cheap plastic suitcases they had dragged into my home. I stated clearly that if they attempted to take a single towel, a single piece of silver, or a single bottle of wine, the sheriff deputies waiting at the end of the driveway would be summoned immediately. I promised them that if they were still standing inside my home when the minute hand struck the quarter hour, I would personally hand the high-definition surveillance footage to the district attorney. I dropped my arm and pointed toward the grand staircase. The 10-minute warning had begun. They did not hesitate. They scrambled toward the stairs, tripping over each other in their desperate, frantic rush to escape the slaughterhouse they had helped build. 6 months passed with the quiet, inevitable speed of a turning season. The grand living room of my estate had long been cleaned of the shattered glass and the lingering smell of expensive champagne. Today, the walls surrounding my family were not made of carved stone and silk wallpaper. They were made of thick concrete and bulletproof glass inside the federal courthouse located downtown. I sat perfectly still in the back row of the gallery, wearing my heavy charcoal suit. The air in the courtroom was incredibly sterile and cold. There were no caterers serving caviar and no jazz bands playing soft music to mask the tension. There was only the heavy, absolute reality of the legal system preparing to crush the arrogance of my son and his wife. The silent adjustment I had set into motion half a year ago was finally reaching its ultimate legal conclusion. Monica was brought into the courtroom first. The physical transformation was absolute and devastating to witness. The stunning high society queen who had paraded around my home in a designer gown and stolen diamonds was entirely gone. She was wearing a loose-fitting bright orange state-issued jumpsuit. Her hair was pulled back tightly, and her face was devoid of the expensive makeup she used to project her superiority. She stood before the state judge, her shoulders slumped forward. The judge did not care about her previous social standing or her wealthy country club friends. He looked down from his high wooden bench and read her final sentence with absolute mechanical precision. He explicitly cited the traumatic nature of her unprovoked physical assault upon an elderly family member. He then highlighted her profound arrogance in violating the mandatory bail conditions right in front of federal law enforcement officers. For these blatant criminal acts, Monica was sentenced to 3 full years in the state penitentiary. She did not scream or fight this time. Her spirit was completely broken. She simply closed her eyes as the heavy metal cuffs were locked around her wrists once again. The deputies led her away through a heavy, secure side door, erasing her from polite society entirely. Bradley was escorted into the federal courtroom an hour later. He looked like a hollowed-out shell of the arrogant entrepreneur who had tried to lock me away in a miserable asylum. His skin was pale, and he had lost a significant amount of weight during his time in the county holding facility. He stood before the federal magistrate, staring down at the polished wooden defense table. The federal prosecutor laid out the undeniable facts of the case, presenting the fraudulent medical injunction and the forged commercial loan documents. The federal judge addressed Bradley directly, stating that his crimes were an act of profound calculated malice against his own father. The judge emphasized that pledging a corporate asset he did not own was a direct attack on the integrity of the federal banking system. The heavy wooden gavel struck the sounding block with a loud cracking sound. Bradley was sentenced to 5 years in a federal correctional facility. There was no leniency offered and absolutely no option for early parole. Just before the federal marshals pulled him away, he turned around and looked directly at me. He was desperately searching for a single ounce of sympathy or regret in my eyes. I gave him absolutely nothing. I simply held his gaze until he was forced to turn away and walk through the secure door to begin his half-decade of concrete isolation. I walked out of the massive courthouse and stepped into the warm afternoon sun. Jonathan Pierce was waiting for me on the wide stone steps holding a final legal dossier. He handed me a single sheet of paper detailing the final fate of Howard and Cynthia. They had narrowly avoided a state prison sentence by agreeing to a massive financial restitution plan for the grand larceny charges. The aggressive repayment schedule ordered by the court had instantly and completely bankrupted them. The prominent local politicians and wealthy friends they had tried so hard to impress had permanently blacklisted them from their social circles. They were now living in a dilapidated, rusted trailer located in a miserable, dusty park on the absolute farthest edge of the county. They were completely destitute, surviving on meager government rations, and turning entirely against each other in their shared misery. The scavengers had finally run out of things to steal, and were left with nothing but the bitter consequences of their own boundless greed. A week after the sentencing, I drove out to the industrial edge of the city. I parked my car in front of the massive commercial warehouse complex that had once housed my son and his failing logistics franchise. The enormous metal roll-up doors were securely locked, and the expansive loading docks were completely empty. The fleet of leased delivery trucks and the arrogant employees were all gone, liquidated by the bankruptcy courts months ago. I unlocked the side access door and stepped inside the cavernous space. The silence echoing off the high steel rafters was deeply satisfying. For 5 years, this building had been a monument to my silent charity and a breeding ground for my son and his profound entitlement. Every square foot of this concrete floor represented money I had quietly sacrificed to keep his fragile ego intact. Now the space was completely stripped bare, swept clean of his lies and his monumental failures. The poison had been physically removed from the property, but I needed to completely purge it from my financial empire. Jonathan Pierce arrived a few minutes later, accompanied by 3 executives from a national distribution conglomerate. They were not looking for a discounted family favor. They were aggressively seeking prime industrial real estate, and they were willing to pay the absolute maximum market price to acquire it. We did not conduct the transaction in a formal boardroom. We stood right there on the cold, concrete floor of the empty warehouse using a heavy wooden shipping crate as a makeshift desk. The executives handed Jonathan the final purchase agreement. I read through the terms confirming the massive multi-million-dollar purchase price. I took a silver pen from my jacket pocket and signed my name on the bottom line. I officially transferred the ownership of the building, severing my final physical tie to the location of my son and his ultimate betrayal. The bank confirmation arrived on my encrypted tablet before the executives even drove out of the parking lot. The massive sum of money had been wired directly into the primary holding account of Summit Commercial Management. I looked at the glowing numbers on the screen. It was a staggering amount of capital, but I felt absolutely no desire to reinvest it or add it to my personal wealth. That money felt heavy and deeply tainted. It was the physical manifestation of the abuse I had suffered and the family I had been forced to destroy. I could not simply fold those funds back into my pristine corporate ledgers. I needed to weaponize that capital one final time, but not for revenge. I needed to use it for absolute restoration. I left the industrial park and drove directly back into the heart of the city. I navigated through the busy downtown streets until I reached a modest brick office building. This was the headquarters of a prominent nonprofit legal foundation dedicated entirely to protecting vulnerable elderly citizens from financial exploitation and physical abuse. I walked into the reception area and asked to speak directly with the executive director. I was led into a small practical office filled with active case files. The director was a weary but fiercely dedicated woman who spent her life fighting the exact same predators who had attempted to consume me. She offered me a seat, assuming I was a victim seeking their limited legal assistance. I did not ask for her help. I reached into my leather portfolio and pulled out a certified cashier check drawn directly from the Summit corporate account. The check represented the entire net profit from the sale of the massive commercial warehouse. I placed the slip of paper face down on her cluttered desk. I told her that I had recently survived a severe attempt on my life and my legacy engineered by my own family. I explained that I had the resources to defend myself, but I knew that thousands of older men and women did not possess those same impenetrable shields. I told her that no one should ever have to face the absolute terror of being targeted by their own flesh and blood without a ruthless legal advocate standing by their side. I asked her to turn the check over. She slowly reached out and flipped the heavy piece of paper. Her eyes widened in absolute shock, and her hands began to tremble as she read the massive multi-million-dollar figure printed across the center line. She looked up at me, completely speechless, tears welling in her eyes. I told her to use every single cent of that money to hire the most aggressive corporate litigators she could find. I instructed her to build an army of lawyers capable of destroying anyone who dared to view the elderly as an expiring resource. I stood up from the chair and walked out of the modest office, leaving her staring at the financial miracle resting on her desk. The tainted wealth had been transformed into a permanent shield for the defenseless. The financial poison was finally completely purged from my life. The morning sun crested the ancient oak trees surrounding my estate, casting long golden shadows across the pristine manicured lawns. I woke up not to the sound of heavy plastic suitcases rolling across marble floors, or the arrogant demands of greedy scavengers. I woke up to the absolute, profound silence of a sanctuary completely restored. The air inside my massive stone home was no longer thick with tension and deceit. It was light, crisp, and entirely my own. I pushed back the heavy silk sheets and stepped out of my bed, feeling a deep, resonant energy in my bones. I walked across the plush carpet of my master suite, the same room where I had once locked myself away to orchestrate the destruction of my own family. That memory felt distant now, like a dark, violent storm that had finally broken against the mountains, leaving only clear, beautiful skies in its wake. The house belonged entirely to me again. Every antique piece of furniture, every rare silver coin, and every vintage bottle of wine rested exactly where it belonged, secure and untouched by greedy hands. I stepped into my master bathroom and turned on the warm vanity lights. I splashed cold water on my face and reached for a thick premium cotton towel. As I dried my skin, I stopped and looked directly into my own eyes in the wide crystal mirror. I turned my head slightly to the left, allowing the bright light to illuminate the right side of my face. The deep, jagged laceration from the Easter dinner had healed months ago, but it had left a permanent physical reminder. A thin, pale silver scar traced a distinct line across my cheekbone. I reached up and ran my thumb over the raised tissue. I did not feel sadness, anger, or regret when I touched it. I felt the absolute, unyielding pride of a survivor. That scar was the exact price of truth. It was the physical catalyst that forced me to open my eyes and recognize the predators living inside my own bloodline. Monica had thrown that heavy crystal wine glass intending to break my spirit and force my total submission. Instead, she had shattered the fragile illusion of our family and unleashed the architect of her own permanent ruin. I smiled at my reflection, feeling the quiet, immense dignity of a man who had successfully defended his fortress against a siege. I dressed in comfortable linen trousers and a soft cashmere sweater, leaving the heavy, bespoke armor hanging in the dark closet. I walked downstairs through the grand foyer, where federal agents had once dragged my son away in steel handcuffs. Today, the polished marble floors gleamed peacefully, reflecting the warm morning light filtering through the tall windows. I walked through the French doors and stepped out onto the expansive stone patio overlooking the sprawling, vibrant gardens. The outdoor wrought iron table was already set with a silver carafe of premium dark roast coffee and a plate of fresh, warm pastries. A few minutes later, the private service gate hummed open, and Jonathan Pierce walked up the gravel path. He was not wearing his intimidating navy blue litigator suit today. He wore a simple open-collared shirt and carried a folded Sunday newspaper under his arm. We had transitioned smoothly from attorney and client to generals who had successfully navigated a brutal war. We were now simply two men enjoying the profound peace we had engineered together. Jonathan sat down across from me, pouring himself a cup of the steaming black coffee. He leaned back in the heavy chair, taking a deep breath of the fresh morning air. He looked across the table and smiled, raising his ceramic mug in a silent toast to our absolute victory. He did not bring up the federal appeals my son was desperately and futilely filing from his concrete prison cell. He did not mention the miserable rusted trailer park where Howard and Cynthia were currently suffocating in their own grinding poverty. We had already closed those files, permanently locking them away in the dark archives of the past. We had excised the cancer, and we refused to let the ghost of the disease ruin our beautiful morning. Instead, we spoke about the weather, the shifting global financial markets, and the incredible aggressive work being done by the legal foundation I had heavily funded. The ruthless lawyers I hired were already dismantling other predators, freeing other vulnerable victims from the exact same financial traps I had narrowly escaped. We sat in comfortable, companionable silence, listening to the gentle rustle of the wind through the oak leaves. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, feeling the rich warmth spread through my chest. I looked out over the vast green expanse of my property, watching a pair of bluebirds land on the stone fountain. I am a 65-year-old man living entirely alone in a massive, sprawling stone estate. Society often tells us that a man in my position should feel lonely, isolated, or tragic. They tell us that blood is thicker than water, and that family must be forgiven and endured at absolutely all costs. I have proven that dangerous philosophy entirely false. I am not lonely. I am completely, deeply unburdened. The toxic rot that had been slowly consuming my life for years was surgically and permanently excised. I traded the miserable, hostile company of greedy scavengers for the absolute quiet dignity of my own unshakable truth. I learned the hardest way possible that true family is not assigned by an accident of birth. It is earned through mutual respect, unwavering loyalty, and a love that does not demand your financial or emotional self-destruction. I survived the ultimate betrayal. I retreated into the shadows, I executed the silent adjustment, and I emerged entirely unbroken. My home is my sanctuary once again. Thank you for listening to my story today. Never let anyone convince you that your quiet generosity is a weakness to be exploited. And never ever be afraid to burn down the entire dining table when the people sitting across from you are only there to eat you alive. The greatest lesson I learned from this ordeal is that unconditional love should never mean unconditional surrender. We are often taught that family is a sacred bond, requiring endless sacrifice. But when blood relatives view your generosity as a weakness to be exploited, that bond becomes a heavy chain. True power does not reside in loud arguments or immediate retaliation. It resides entirely in the quiet, absolute enforcement of your own boundaries. Real family is built on mutual respect and genuine loyalty, not a sickening entitlement to your life and your resources. It is always better to stand alone with your dignity completely intact than to be surrounded by people who only value what they can steal from your hands. Please share your own experiences of setting firm boundaries with toxic family members in the comments below, and subscribe to the channel for more stories of absolute resilience.